At a time where mediocrity in the watch world is often revered and celebrated, there's nothing more refreshing than a watch that arrives and delivers a punch. Most would not imagine it would come from a brand like Zenith, but there we go. Second year in a row that the brand continues to defy expectations. I've really got to stop with the puns before the start of a video. Zenith has finally answered the call and created a diver again. It has been decades, and it just so happens that a few months ago I made a video on the channel about the original Defy. Now granted, it's a polarizing watch, it isn't everyone's cup of tea, and in fact the watches we're covering today, very much the same scenario. But these are the sorts of pieces I enjoy talking about. Ones that don't get everything right, that aren't on the prescribed list of watches to follow. And in a world where so much about design is absolutely linked with conformity and what will sell best, there is no better occasion to look at a design for its style and its substance instead of its overall mass appeal. Let's start by saying that Zenith has been doing so well lately. Just this year alone, they've not only given us an entirely fresh edition of annual calendar chronographs which look world class, and in fact I wouldn't be surprised if there's going to be a deal struck up between Zenith and Breitling, now owners of Universal Genève, in order to obtain these calibers one way or another, borrowing some of these movements for their upcoming pieces in the now newly refreshed Universal Genève catalogue. But Zenith also launched some of the best releases of Watches and Wonders, hands down. The Defy chronograph, which is safe to say it's as near as perfect as far as an integrated bracelet chronograph goes. There's basically nothing to fault about this design. How Zenith's approach is absolutely there, from a modern stance, using the Defy DNA, and being able to create balance and harmony across a very simple looking presentation. And then out of the blue, out of the deep blue, Zenith decides to drop the reference A3648, as well as an entirely new interpretation of a modern diver. Now granted, the original Defy diver turns the funk factor up to 11, but still, I am a huge fan of these oddities. Thing is though, we're here today to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of these dive watches that didn't do everything perfectly, and maybe underscoring that these come across as too contemporary for modern audiences. And then how the design of the Extreme Diver could have been improved in a few places. At least that's the goal of the video. It's quite a lofty one. Now at the time of this recording, Zenith has made my life a little bit more difficult. There are no promotional videos about it, there's no unveiling videos, so I'm a little bit sparse, makes my job of editing all the better. I'm going to be using snippets from Alexander's video from Watch Advisor for portions of this clip. I'll link his full video in the corner of the screen. I highly recommend his YouTube channel. As a matter of fact, around this time of the year, Watches and Wonders, many new releases, his channel is always a go-to for me. For industry information, him talking with the professionals, as well as the excellent camera footage. So it's always best to start at the beginning, but I'm not going to cover the background of the Zenith Defy. That video will be linked in the corner of the screen. It was designed to be the most bulletproof watch of its day, and in fact it did pretty well in 1969. So right around the same time, Zenith decided to unveil the A3648 diver, and I hope I'm getting these references right. The question to ask is, what word best describes this watch? Is it A, funky, B, too small? Is it C, ugly, or D, orange? Yes. Hindsight, looking at this design, it has so much Doxa DNA behind it, and I wouldn't be surprised if the brand was inspired solely by Doxa's divers of 1967. It was quite a great piece of kit. It was rated to 600 meters of water resistance, which was sort of unheard of at the time. It was built tough, and it also had a very decent and wearable size. But it definitely was a watch of its time, of the late 1960s, and you don't have to be a detective to work this one out. Way too much orange. Saying that though, it's exciting. Being the debut diver under the Defy name for the brand, it had to make a statement, and safe to say I think it did. But let us be honest, as far as a practical dive watch goes, it's kinda useless. First thing is the color theory. The choice of orange is probably the worst color choice you could possibly go for, which seems counterintuitive, but after 15 feet of depth in water, the color virtually disappears. It goes grey. The very skinny bezel insert would be difficult to read. The watch is overly polished, and even though there is a lot of color contrast, the contrast that matters are between the plots and the hands, and there just isn't enough. I love it for its sheer impracticality as a dive watch. It's a novelty thing for me, I think. There's so much focus on perfect today that getting the watches that were nowhere near perfect, it appeals to me. I don't know why. So for Zenith to introduce a new range of modern, up-to-date divers, they have more than enough areas to pull inspiration from. For the most part, it's great seeing how the modern Defy DNA has been extrapolated and used here. The case integration, the interchangeable lug elements for the bracelets and straps, the star motif on the dial. And we can also see how the A3648 has had influence here. But there's also more than a few things with this modern interpretation that has left me scratching my head. Some very questionable choices. You see, the hardest thing when creating something as significant as this, an entirely new dive range, is that you need to find that identity. You need to actually create that identity into something that's going to be recognizable, and it's more difficult than people think. For a watch like the Defy, it needs to be bold, it needs to be aggressive, but as much as it needs to go against the grain, I think the first time dive watch in this family, it needs to be more balanced. And there's something thrown off about this design that I've tried to unpack and understand. The first thing that hit me when I saw this watch unveiled was that I had seen this watch before. Something in the back of my mind said that this piece already exists, and it took a bit of time for me to register, but the Zodiac Super Seawolf 53. Tell me that you don't see any similarities on this dial, from the handset to the plots. It's quite jarring, right? And the case design, it's definitely a part of the Defy collection, but when you look closer, especially to those crown guards, how about the Hodinkee Royal Oak Offshore Diver? Yeah. See, my main argument after all of that is that Zenith could have done a lot more with less here. Instead of going from A to Z with the most extreme examples, Zenith could have looked elsewhere for inspiration in the first place. How about a reference like the S58, which is more linked to the 1950s, one of their earliest dive watches, or a far more impressive mid-60s design that came out just before the Defy, the A3630, and using this watch as the starting platform. This is such a great looking piece that wouldn't raise any eyebrows. In fact, I think it would get a standing ovation, considering that it would use a thin, sleek case profile, blends of black and silver on its dial. This would be a perfect formula, especially considering that Zenith takes great pride in creating these excellently thin movements that would suit these cases so well. And maybe that's my problem. I like to look at these dive watches as the best possible end-all, be-all solution. Given all of the options, how could the brand create the best possible model that also has all of the brand DNA to show for it? And for 10 grand plus of your currency, it better be great. Now the issues with this dive watch, it's to do with things like its cost overall, of course. Its thickness of 15.5 millimeters. How the handset on the dial appears quite jarring, how the date window didn't have to be at the 3 o'clock position. And really all I would want to do, with a few adjustments, is to make it even closer affiliated to the original variant, by removing the crown guards and placing the crown at the 4 o'clock position. I think to this day it's still one of the best options for a dive watch. Look at a brand like Seiko, at Zin, they've made such huge inroads with this development and this technology. It's one of the best positions because you don't need to worry about having crown guard protection in the first place, and it just so happens that the original variant of the Defy Diver had it there too. I would then remove the date window at the 3 o'clock position and put it at the 6. Increase the balance, increase the symmetry across the dial. And then finally, using a simpler handset to improve its overall readability and tying the design together better. My diagnosis is I believe the Extreme Diver is too aggressive for the sake of it. I believe that during the design process, the brand didn't step back enough and consider that this being their official first modern dive watch, it needed to have a broader appeal. It needed to be more recognizable and not so brutal. And knowing Zenith as a brand, they create such beautiful pieces of design. They understand the marriage of elegance with bulletproof, burly exteriors. And the result that I'm showing you is something that I would have preferred to see. Something a bit more pleasing to the eye, something that's a bit more balanced, but a watch that is undoubtedly a Zenith Defy. With all of that criticism aside, there is a lot to be said about these pieces, what they represent, considering Zenith is back in the dive watch space. But there are drawbacks, namely the price, which is no surprise. The overall thickness of the watch is going to turn a lot of people away. The diameter of the watch is going to turn others away. And I think the root of this argument is that the Extreme Defy Diver should have been made a little bit more visually appealing in order to attract a new audience, especially considering that this is their first. For all of that said, you can't knock this watch. Its innovative new ideas, the interchangeable lug system, blending titanium, steel, and so many other materials together. It's just refreshing to say the brand now creates a dive watch. But I want to know your impressions. What do you think about this piece? Was it also one of your favorite releases of the year? And where do you think they could go with this line next? And thank you for taking the time to watch this video. See you in the next one.